This is the Debrief presented by BrightHire. The Debrief is a series of conversations with founders, executives, talent thought leaders on how they've built talented and diverse teams. I am your host, Teddy Chestnut, BrightHire co-founder, and today I am truly thrilled to welcome to the screen Rosanna Durruthy, LinkedIn's VP of Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging, former Chief Diversity Officer of Cigna and Vivendi, talent alchemist. Rosanna, thank you so much for joining me today. Let's get back at it. Your go-to interview question.
Go-to interview question. What's the gnarliest relationship you've had at work, and how did you work it out?
What is the gnarliest relationship you've had at work, and how did you work it out?
Yep.
No, I'm asking you again.
Me?
Yeah.
Oh gosh. Okay, now I've got to own up. In one of my previous lives, I had a boss who I thought was an absolute jerk. And what I realized, one of my strong suits is being smart. And we'd go to meetings and we'd be in team meetings. I would say things to him that would kind of leave him scratching his head, but my colleagues knew me so well, they'd be cracking up because they knew that I was actually making fun of him. It was not a good moment in my life. I learned that you can never allow someone else's demeanor or personality or the things they do determine how you behave. And my own lack of maturity showed up in those moments. Mm-hmm. And so I finally recognized, as part of my own leadership journey, you've got to bring grace to the game. You can't utilize strengths to put other people down or to demean them. So despite the fact that he and I never went on to be in love with each other, I recognized the importance of respecting him and allowed myself the space to be my better self. But it took a little.
That's a good one. If you were going to roll the tape all the way back to the beginning of your career and build a completely different one, what would it have been?
I've got to tell you, I've had that question before. I love what I do so much. I would do this all over again. And when I started my career, this didn't exist. So this wasn't something I planned for. This is something that has come naturally, and it aligns really well with my desire to make a difference in the world and have people realize and fulfill their potential. So yeah, I'd want to come back and do this all over again.
I love it. Your Twitter handle is @talentalchemist.
Yes.
Why? Where did that come from?
Because I really believe that we each have unique abilities and experiences that create insights that enable us to bring something that no one else can. But in the company of another individual's greatness, two greatnesses that are unrelated form magic, and that magic is alchemy. And so I really believe that we are greater not because we're amazing, we're greater because other people complement us, and together you can raise the level of the game. And I really believe in the power of teams, and in this case, diverse teams to win. And when they do, it's a form of talent alchemy.
That's very cool. All right, last rapid fire. What's your most unpopular opinion?
Diversity training is necessary, not sufficient for creating diversity, inclusion, and belonging. In fact, I think the world spends too much time doing diversity training and not recognizing the power of being authentic to create an environment where everyone belongs.
Heretical for a chief diversity officer to say that you shouldn't.
Perfect word. It's totally heretical. And I've gotten, it's truly unpopular amongst my peers in diversity. When I arrived at Cigna, the first thing I did was cancel diversity training. People were trained. They could tell me the date they went to the training and who was in their training course, but they didn't exhibit any of the behaviors, which allowed me to see there's this trap door that opens up. People go through diversity training and they'd fall out the other end, not transforming their ability to create that experience of belonging for others. So training is important, necessary, not sufficient for change.
Okay, we were going to talk about this at the end of the conversation, but we're right here. So I'm going to take the thread and run with it.
Sure.
Okay, if not diversity training, then what?
It's who are you being in your relationships? It's an understanding that people embody talent, and how well you get to know that individual will give you access to understanding what that talent might look like. And, I think the big challenge is we've created this anomalous structure where people go to diversity training and their opinion may be that this is necessary for someone else, not for me, or their opinion may be this is totally useless. But what we really fail to do is demonstrate that there are skills that are necessary for leaders to be effective as leaders in today's environment. Maybe it wasn't true 50 years ago, but it's certainly true today. And so this is no longer optional. The ability to lead a diverse team, not optional. The ability to understand how you unlock an individual's abilities and skills from their experiences requires trust. So if you don't know them, it's highly likely that you'll have someone who can perform in a role, but they won't necessarily unlock that discretionary ability they have, because that requires working with someone you trust. And so it really requires changing this whole paradigm, because diversity isn't something you do to someone else. To be an effective, inclusive leader, that's a transformation you go through for yourself. That's about being an awesome leader who can work with anyone and help them not only realize their potential, but contribute to the team that you lead. And it's in that contribution that your team gets better.
Okay, I've got a couple threads on this. One is, so if training isn't enough, training still does create a dedicated space and time to dedicate energy to this topic. So if training isn't the right vehicle, where in the cadence of work, where in people's routines are you creating the space for this kind of focus? How are you weaving it in if it's not in a dedicated space and time like in a training?
So there's a real power. Training can sometimes be the catalyst if an individual is ready to receive it. If you go into it resistant, it can appear a lot like 10th grade algebra. You live through it, you don't necessarily remember it after you've done it, and you don't look to do it again. But if we think about how training is an opportunity to create a new awareness, an awareness not of what's wrong, but an awareness of what's missing. This is a skill set that's missing for most of us because we weren't taught as kids, we weren't taught in school, probably weren't taught in grad school, what it is to go into someone else's space and not only find your comfort level with their difference. What does it look like to invite someone into your space and have them be comfortable and be themselves in it? And, this idea of diversity isn't necessarily about the other, but it's about how we navigate an environment and we can feel entirely confident and empowered and be ourselves. And some of us find that really naturally. We don't have to think about it. You and I have talked about this. You can walk into a space and you don't think twice about walking into that space and what people think when they see you walk into that space. But if you are someone who's different from everyone else in the room, it becomes very evident very quickly. And so this ability to create awareness, and I've often started this, and you may have heard me say this to leaders, Teddy. I ask people to think about, the experience they may have had with a sibling they might be related to, and especially if they're related to that sibling biologically and they shared the same bedroom growing up and shared the same bathroom, and now they come together occasionally for holidays in a non-COVID environment, and how it's not unusual to look at that person across the table and wonder how you could possibly be related to them. They remember things differently. They respond to life differently. They live a life that's a total contrast to your own life. That person's the other, and they share your last name, share DNA, and shared the environment you grew up in. The other isn't based on race or gender. The other is based on our own view of life, and the other is that person you see in the mirror. So how do we grow more compassionate, more curious about people who are different from ourselves? How do we drop the judgment so that we can build another level of understanding things we're not familiar with?
Fascinating. All right, let's rewind back to where your journey started. So you spent the first 10 years on Wall Street in HR and recruiting leadership roles. How was that experience formative for you and your worldview as it relates to diversity, inclusion, belonging?
It was a great experience for myth busting. So as an example, when I got to Merrill Lynch, I was doing diversity recruiting for one of the leading investment banks, in the world at the time. And I would walk into rooms and I was recruiting at, Ivy League campuses, which is a real treat, particularly given that I didn't have my college degree. And I saw that the manner in which candidates were treated often began with a question about where they went to school. And so there was a little voice playing in my head about, people need to know I don't have my degree, or I don't want anyone to feel like I've misrepresented my credentials and my skills. I remember the first time I walked into a meeting with a managing director, and his first question was, "Where did you go to school?" I said, "Harvard." And he stopped asking questions. And in that moment, I really got, it really didn't matter that I didn't get my degree from Harvard. I was in the club because I went to Harvard. And I understood that was real privilege. Like, I got that a lot of other things that probably would have made me subject to, is she qualified to be in the room, never occurred because I could answer that one question with one word. Now, it's also made me really aware that when I talk to people, they can have amazing abilities, but if they didn't get the opportunity to go to a great school like Harvard, they're already going to face all sorts of headwinds. So my work has always been about, how do I remove the headwinds? How do I let people's greatness just show when they walk in the door? How do I help them win the offer, win the opportunity?
Were words like inclusion and belonging even part of the vernacular?
Belonging, definitely not. In fact, elitism was like a cool thing. Like, you wanted to be different, you wanted to be a cut above, and you wanted to create a space where not everyone could get in.
Mm-hmm.
And that's true with some of the universities that people get to go to as well. Harvard was definitely that for me while I was there. It was very much a case of, no one has the right to pick on you except we at Harvard, which is an interesting experience. And so this idea of exceptionalism was often used to keep people out. But what was really fascinating as I matured was seeing that there are exceptional people that you don't recognize because there are presumptions either based on where they went to school or how they appear or where they even worked. And I think because I began my career in sales, I understood that sometimes the opportunity was just one that had to be discovered. And talent is the same way. It may not always appear through the first 5 questions we ask, like the right fit, but then if you reverse that, what are they adding to the environment potentially if you can understand what makes them different? And how does that difference not only contribute to the fabric of the work being done, but more importantly, how does it contribute to eliminating the blind spots that might exist on your team? And so, having been a recruiter for so much of my life, it's always been this game of discovery and understanding that you've got to look for what you want. It's not always going to be patently obvious. And it's that exploration and curiosity that has always served me well.
I'm interested to dive into that. So you were at Merrill, you were running the diversity recruiting program. You hired over 250 women and people of color into analyst and associate roles. You built a mentorship program. You started to source from non-traditional talent pools like University of Puerto Rico.
Yeah.
What were the foundations of your success in that role? What did you have to get right in order to be successful?
Well, I think diversity recruiting in some ways is the opposite of conventional recruiting. And what I mean by it's being the opposite is you don't go to the same place to find the same profile, to build on the same experiences. And, we may have thought it easy as recruiters that, if an individual works in a particular company and they're successful, like, Salesforce has great salespeople, I just go to Salesforce to recruit. Well, the reality is you're also defining your culture by another environment's culture. Because people don't just bring their experiences, they bring their way of thinking, they bring their way of operating. And so that kind of indoctrination has a real way of shaping the culture, the environment you're in. So my philosophy is if we want to create amazing cultures and we want to create amazing environments, we've got to be able to have the ability to mold, that greatness from our talent. And I'm just a curious person. And so, I'm a real believer that we develop skills in any number of different ways. And it doesn't have to be the same job that we recruited the last person from to find the next great talent to do this work. And so you can look for skills in what people do in extracurricular sports. You can find skills in what people are doing, after school or after work in their volunteer activities. You can find skill in how people have had to navigate difficult situations in their personal life. And so the extent to which we look for skills as opposed to looking for experiences, begins to unlock a whole valley of talent that no one's gotten to. And when you get to that talent first, you not only experience people who are grateful, you usually experience people who are open-minded, like they haven't been coded or programmed to do things and see things a certain way. They're actually more malleable. And that creates a resilience to circumstances, the circumstances your company's going through, whether it's a fast growth company or it's a company in a turnaround period, or maybe you've had to redirect and you're embarking on a new strategy. You want to find people who have the agility to adapt to the environment, the ability to move quickly. And that doesn't happen when people are accustomed to certain environments with a certain way of operating. And it's a lot like being a carpenter who only has a hammer. When you need that Phillips screwdriver, you're still hammering your way through a circumstance. So that agility around skill is what I think for me has been the benefit of being a diversity recruiter first. I look for different people with different talent and different experiences. And sometimes that talent is sitting right next to you and you don't realize it. So you've got to get curious about the people around you, in front of you, people who are across the street from you.
Yeah. All right. I've got a couple very tactical questions about this role, the diversity recruiting role that you were in. Who did you report to? Like, did it roll up into talent acquisition? Did it roll up into diversity? Like, the reporting structure can tell a lot about how much emphasis an organization places on this, how you have to influence across the organization. Like, what was the actual organizational structure of diversity recruiting?
So it actually reported into talent acquisition. At the time, it was the head of talent acquisition for the institutional client group, which was investment banking, debt and equity markets. So, it was all about the business. And my peers were recruiters for the business. I, too, was a recruiter for all of the businesses, though. While they might have been dedicated to the debt and equity markets or sales and trading or investment banking, my role cut across all of them. And one of the great things about diversity recruiting is that you learn to adapt to the environment. You learn to understand not just the part of the environment, but the whole. So there are times when you are able to see that an individual's ability not only is a fit for one area of the business, but it may be an equal or better fit for another area of the business. So you can't live with tunnel vision when you're engaged in diversity recruiting.
Was the role that you took an existing role, or was it a new role that you were you creating this diversity recruiting role?
It preceded me and the individual I reported to in the beginning, and she had been in the role for a couple of years. And then we decided to expand a little more. And, that's where relationships like the University of Puerto Rico came in. Big secret that's still out there. Puerto Rico is part of the United States. They graduate more engineers who are Latino than all the universities combined on the mainland. So you go to a place like University of Puerto Rico, Mayagüez, where there's an engineering school, you can find amazing talent. And what led me to that was seeing that there were companies that back in the 90s were like leading companies in the world of engineering and manufacturing. And that's where they went to recruit their talent. But it never occurred to folks in the investment banking field to look at the University of Puerto Rico to recruit individuals who had great mathematical abilities, creative skills, bilingual at a minimum to be able to work in an environment and create new opportunities. And it was also going to be a big stretch for people coming from a place like UPR and other schools where they didn't know investment bankers. So it wasn't a career they ever thought about. So in many ways, I had to be the broker. I had to both broker the credibility on the investment banking side to go to a school that they had never recruited from, and then broker credibility with students around what this opportunity looked like, where they would need to leave the island and go work on Wall Street.
There are probably folks on the line, talent acquisition leaders, who are thinking about, they're getting to a scale and they're thinking, okay, we need to prioritize diversity recruiting. Do I create a dedicated role like diversity recruiting, or do I try to have everybody on the team own this all together? And I'm curious, having been in a role where it was specific to you, you owned it, pros, cons, would you make that decision again? Is it better in a certain context versus another? Like, how do you think about that organizational?
If you're getting it started, I think the pros of having someone who's dedicated to it is that they can actually invest in the relationships. Mm-hmm. If you're going to new sources of talent, like universities, like historically Black colleges or Hispanic serving institutions, you need to invest over a 3-year horizon. Showing up on campus year one won't get you very much other than the visibility. But now you've got to build the credibility and the trust. Are you going to come back? Are you really interested in building a relationship with that university or that resource? Maybe it's a professional association like National Black MBA or Prospanica. Or are you just showing up because you're trying to recruit diverse talent and you're not really interested in contributing to the environment or the ecosystem? So you got to make a 3-year commitment. You want to put someone in who actually can connect with that community. It doesn't necessarily imply that person needs to be a person who comes from that demographic, but it definitely needs to be someone who authentically is interested in understanding what are the challenges, what are the opportunities, who are the people in that environment, and are willing to build relationships in that environment. This is all about now how you're cultivating a network, and that network needs to be bridged, a bridge of trust. It means that you're going in and you're offering something and you're taking something out and you're recognizing and acknowledging that. And so I think it can be a really healthy way for an organization to start. The downside is when that person who is trying to build the talent pipeline is boxed out of opportunities because they're not aligned to a particular business. So we as recruiters have to be mindful of our own sharp elbows, even with our peers, where we create this elitist structure of like, well, that's not what we're looking for. Well, maybe you need to lean in a little bit and understand, does this person have the potential and the ability? And what do we need to do? And I'd go one step further. If you want to build credibility with talent that has never been in environments like yours or isn't familiar with the business or industry you're in, introduce them to people. Demystify what you're doing. I brought scores of amazing talent onto the street and had them walk through the bullpen at Merrill Lynch and took them onto the trading floor. They'd never seen a trading floor. They didn't know what it was like. You could see that they were either excited or horrified, and it says a lot about an individual's ability. But really important, I would introduce them to someone who could just talk to them about the work product, like, what is it that you do? What does this work look like? How do I know if I'm getting it right? How do you get your questions answered? Who answers those questions for you? When you demystify, people will show up and they will show you how they can do the work themselves. And so we can't just test people to see if they're qualified to do the job. We actually have to help people orient themselves to what this work might entail. And you'd be surprised. There are a lot of qualified people out there, but if you're trying to make your environment a mystery and you're presuming that people already know what you do and how you do it, then that is the conventional approach of recruiting. You've got to figure out how we work as opposed to how do I help you see how we work? And then you allow me to see whether you can do this job.
So you talked about the benefit of having an individual who can build bridges externally to the right communities, the right talent pools. There's the other side of this, right? Which is you don't own every requisition. You don't work with every hiring manager. And ultimately, the recruiters working those requisitions, the hiring managers assessing for those roles need to be open to considering candidates with nonlinear, non-traditional backgrounds. Absolutely. What was your, did you feel like you carried the burden of that direction and change management as well? Like, how do you think about that side of the equation?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely did, but I also suffer from having a very high index of ownership over the things I do. And so I like winning. I didn't just want to recruit a person for the role. I wanted to understand the role. So I spent time on the trading floor. I spent time sitting in the bullpens. I would work late so that I got to know the investment bankers so that they would begin to trust me. So it wasn't just phoning in the talent. I wasn't supplying lists of people. And back then in those old days, they were like real Facebooks, and you're going through these books and you're identifying talent that you're going to interview. Yeah, for me, it was really about having the credibility to talk about why is this person qualified to do this work? What are the skills that they bring that may be missing for us? How would this person be able to make that adaptation? Is there evidence of how they've adapted to other circumstances? So as a recruiter, perhaps I was always being interviewed as well, and I needed to make sure that I could bring the credibility by having evidence of what makes a person capable of doing the job. And then when we would have, final round interviews, I'd be there as well in the debrief because I, wanted to understand what's going on in the room. What did you see? What didn't you see? And lastly, I always want to be able to give a candidate feedback. So I was one of those recruiters who just needed to understand what people did well and what they didn't do well. Because even when I started out in sales and I was placing talent in roles, when they didn't get the offer, I wanted them to be left in a better position to seal the deal the next go round. I needed them to understand, where could you have improved your game or not? And that requires courage for any recruiter. In diversity recruiting, I felt it was my obligation to be able to do that. But you've got to make the investment to have the credibility in the room in order to bring valuable information to the people you're trying to bring into the environment.
That just sounds like good recruiting.
It really is. You are the brand. Like,
yeah.
We're the brand. And so we've got to be able to
understand the business, build trust with your hiring manager, be able to advocate for candidates regardless of their background, know exactly what those hiring managers are going to test for, what's going to resonate with them, and build the credibility to push back when they raise questions.
That's it. You know, so, and hire people who have greater potential than just the role they're going into.
Okay. Let's dig on that one a little bit. Actually, in the last debrief, Mike Amson, who's now CEO of Relativity, talked about this paradigm of, you're either hiring somebody who can hit the ground running, or you're hiring somebody for how far they can run.
Right.
Like, can they run fast right now, or can they run the distance? And in diversity recruiting, when you're hiring from non-traditional, non-linear backgrounds, you're almost, maybe not by definition, but much more likely to be hiring on how far can this person run versus can they literally do the job right now because they have pattern recognition and they've done exactly that thing before.
Exactly. 99% of the time.
How do you, very tactically, a recruiter screen, you have half an hour. How are you testing for that level of potential, that level of, that upside in a candidate, and bottling that and then communicating it, in these discrete interactions with the candidate?
Yeah, I've got to admit, I probably have a bias for composure. How does the person I'm interviewing maintain their composure? What kind of questions are they asking me? As I share with them about the environment, are they able to draw connections to things they've done? Or are they open and transparent about, not having those experiences? I look for people with strong communication skills, because I think it's always really important to be able to express what you know and what you don't know. I look for people who are curious, because if you're curious, it gives me some semblance of hope that you're going to ask and you're going to lead by that. And I think those are really important skills when you're looking for people who can come into environments that are changing. Most of our environments are. Most of our environments require people with a growth mindset. It's a pretty foregone conclusion that 5 years from now, we'll be operating in very different environments than the one we're in today. And today we're operating in an environment that's different from 5 years ago. So I need to be able to see the potential to grow with the future rather than hang on to, the railings and pretend that the world's not going to change, because it's changing all the time. And if you're not someone who's able to change with it, you unfortunately go the way of the dinosaur.
Have you found any effective, and I want to get to your role as Chief Diversity Officer, but one more question around recruiting and hiring in particular. How do you drive behavior change across hiring managers and interviewers to test for those sorts of qualities? And I guess a corollary is, you talked about how diversity training doesn't work. Does interview training work? Is that an important mechanism to help achieve that goal? Is it necessary but not sufficient? What have you seen actually work to get hiring teams to go from, I need to hire somebody who fits this cookie cutter and has the pattern recognition, to, I'm open to hiring somebody who can go the distance but is going to learn and grow along the way?
Yeah, I think like many of us, you've got to be a good coach along the way. And so I coach the people who are hiring, because I recognize if we want them to operate from a different pattern recognition process, we've got to help them safely create that change. So to be in this work of diversity is to be a change leader at the end of the day. You've got to help people identify what their concerns, what their, what stops them, and then break through that stop. And sometimes it means, what can we do to create safeguards, and how do we ensure that we're not creating barriers, but we're addressing opportunities responsibly? And you can't just close your eyes and say, okay, let's do this. You've got to actually be aware. That awareness is critical. The learning process is really for the hiring manager just as much as it is for the candidate who becomes the new hire. And so, for a manager who hasn't been on this journey, I've got to be patient. I've got to understand what their strengths and weaknesses are. I've got to understand where their stops are and recognize how I can help them navigate the moment. Managers are afraid to fail. Candidates are afraid to fail. We're dealing with mirror images of the same circumstances. So I wouldn't want to treat the manager any differently, and I want to create new value in their experience. And when they learn and they see that learning creates a differentiated outcome, there's almost an excitement, like, okay, when can we do this again? And they become evangelists, and they help others in the environment process differently, respond differently, recognize the power to bring in new talent and create success with that new talent.
Guys, there's actually a couple of questions that got thrown in the chat that are related to this topic specifically that I want to jump into. So Devin asked along the lines of helping people hire for non-traditional, non-linear backgrounds. Do detailed interview or hiring rubrics that are focused on transferable skills, have you found that those actually help? Like, what's the value of those?
They can help, but I think it's really important to always recognize that even if people have the right answers, is the manager confident enough to trust? Like, I think we all recognize there are times when we've hired people who don't meet the job spec entirely, but there's a confidence that they have and a confidence that the hiring manager has. And then there are occasions where people, they meet all of the criteria, but there's still something that keeps that manager from saying, let's give that person a shot. So rubrics are important. They create clarity. Anywhere that you have clarity, at least you know what you're trying to arrive at. The question is that clarity designed to open the window and let new air in, or is it designed to close off anything that doesn't already look like what you have in that environment today?
A lot of what you're describing, being patient, really investing, coaching your hiring managers, hard to do when you're like growing really fast, moving very quickly, scaling up. Like, how, we can see this breakdown when you're moving quickly. How do you create the organizational space for this kind of work to happen? You were like Blockbuster, right? You moved headquarters, Florida to Texas. You hired 700 people in 12 months at the corporate level, like big important jobs. Like, how do you create the kind of space for this kind of relationship, this personal journey that you're talking about when you're operating at a really fast pace?
Yeah, some of those days were really long days. And I've got to admit, again, it was in the midst of tons of change. I moved to 2 cities in the space of 4 months. I had a new leadership team because the people who hired me didn't relocate. And sometimes you'll see things that others don't see, and you've got to figure out how to convince them of it. And sometimes you can't. I think you've got to find a way to understand, what does creating space look like for you? Otherwise, the risk of burnout comes not only because you're moving so quickly, you're also experiencing some level of anxiety or distrust for the pace that you're moving in. I always start with trust, because if you don't have that, if you can't create it, it makes it really hard to feel belonging. It also makes it really hard to have confidence in what you're doing. And so as leaders, we always have to look at, how am I cultivating trust? How am I pausing to look around and observe the environment and understand what's thriving and what's not thriving? Am I being intentional in thinking about that even, or am I just being carried by the current? And the reality is, some of us get carried by the current. My first year at Blockbuster, I was super stoked and excited. At first I was totally scared witless. And then I thought, wow, how many heads of talent get an opportunity to join an organization? Then you've got to replace 70% of the corporate headquarters inside of 1 year. It was really scary. And it was an amazing transformation for me, as we brought in all sorts of new technology and new teams. And I met amazing people and leaders. And I was able to hire some extraordinary folks. The first Black woman CEO in the Valley, a woman by the name of Shelley Archambault, was the first head of e-commerce at Blockbuster, and I got to hire her. And
that one, so there's actually a question that got posted to the chat, which got upvoted a couple of times, which is related to this specifically or tangentially, which is, how do you think about driving influence at the executive level versus the middle manager level? Like, where do you, if you had to place your bets, if you had to exert energy, what's harder? What do you do first? Like, what drives more effective change?
So as a TA leader, and I would say just as a leader in the talent space, we're looking at, an environment, you've got to understand where the influence in that environment sits. It's sometimes really easy to default and think that the influence is just with the executives. Sometimes you don't need a tight relationship with all of the executives. It's one or two executives on the team who really kind of influence the other executives, or perhaps have the bigger businesses. But it's equally important when we think about something like diversity recruiting, and you think about what you're investing your recruiting strategy in attracting. Are we going to change the game by hiring everyone at the junior level, or do we need to bring in some talent at more senior levels as well to help not just make the case, but to help build the current? And that current is about trust. That current is about people who are seen as being capable and influential and able to do this too. Competition is natural to most environments, and most managers want what some other successful manager has. And that manager who's good at building diverse teams, if we acknowledge them and recognize that ability and hold them up as an example of how it can get done, sometimes it can create what I call the contagion, where other leaders start to get curious and see, well, if I do that, I can still be successful. And if I do that, that'll actually help my team create a different outcome and new results. So really important to think about this portfolio of relationships you have. Where does the credibility in the organization rest? And can you go into that corner of the organization and have credibility as well? When you think about your objectives, whether you call them MBOs or OKRs or CFOs, are you thinking about the people you need to build relationships with along with the work you need to accomplish? And are you thinking of who's going to help you accomplish that work faster? Early on, I recognized the power of building the network actually accelerates the outcomes. Otherwise, you're busy trying to make an outcome happen without the enrollment and buy-in of the people who are actually in a position to make it easier for you and able to benefit from the results and outcomes you're trying to create.
Interesting transition to your roles as Chief Diversity Officer. What's your job?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think my job, specifically in the role I'm in today, is to create access to the vision that LinkedIn has built. So our vision is to create economic opportunity for every member of the global workforce, but opportunity without access is kind of a moot point. So diversity, inclusion, and belonging is about ensuring that there's access to that opportunity for every member of the global workforce. And that begins with LinkedIn, ensuring that we've got talent that's representative of our members, that can help build solutions for our customers, that create value for those customers, that we create an environment where we not only have diversity and representation, but an inclusive way of operating where people genuinely can feel they belong and where they thrive. So my work isn't for a segment of the organization. My work touches the whole of the organization, including all of our employees and leaders, and it's about making everyone more successful.
There's a couple of really interesting questions in the chat that dig into this tactically. One is around, what does success look like? Like, how do you measure, how are you defining what success looks like? How are you measuring what success looks like? How are you communicating back to the CEO, to ultimately to Satya at Microsoft? Like, we are achieving our goals. We are achieving ROI on this investment in diversity.
So success begins by understanding what our true north is as a company. Like, what are we trying to accomplish as a company, and how does the work of creating greater diversity and inclusion impact that? How do we connect with members and understand what members are experiencing on the platform? How do our employees experience the environment? We all know that recruitment is often associated with another word that has nothing to do with recruitment: retention. Two opposite facing constructs. And yet people leave when they're unhappy. So understanding what makes people unhappy or what makes people distrust the environment becomes really important. So success for me looks like, how are we creating an environment where we measurably are able to look at where that talent is represented? And are we able to address the challenges that people may face? So some of you may have read previous diversity reports that we've released. One of the things that we saw was that we were experiencing greater attrition with underrepresented groups. And we invested the time to understand not only from the people who are in the company, who were members of those groups, but people who had left the company. And not in the exit interview. We waited till 6 months had passed to talk to people who had left the company, recognizing that it's a zone of safety that you want to create around this conversation. Like, what could we have done better? What are you seeing today on the outside that you didn't see from the inside? What are things that you think we do incredibly well? And you get a fairly unbiased and uncensored expression from people who've left because they want to see the organization succeed. And utilizing that, it allows you to see people leave when they don't see themselves in leadership. And what I mean by that is, it's not enough to have me in a leadership role. Like, people want to know that the head of sales and leaders in sales are individuals who may share similarity either of experience or background, or people who are invested in them. There's an important role that leaders play in today's environment in sponsoring, being sponsors of talent. And we sometimes think of that word with great formality, but the informality may look like you're new to a company and you meet a leader and that leader says to you, "Hey, have you met John? He's really great. He's someone you should get to know." That's sponsorship. John has a sponsor. He may not even know it, but you've now been directed to connect with someone because he can create value for you. And you likely can create value for that person as well. And so, there's a lot that transpires that success looks like. How do we become aware of what we're doing that creates the outcomes we create? And if we're given to creating a different outcome, what is that outcome? Is it representation? Is it how we're growing talent? Is it in the experience our employees are having? Is it in the effectiveness of people managers to be able to attract and build the talent that they have? Is it in career mobility? Are we satisfied bringing people in and having them leave in 2 years to go on to their next play? Or do we want them to stay and grow a career at LinkedIn? And then how are we aligning all of our systems to drive those outcomes? Performance management and talent review and succession planning. So success for me looks like alignment of expectations, alignment of systems to create amazing experiences for our employees as they create a product that enables people to realize their potential and to have opportunity to grow their wealth.
A lot of what you've described around what success looks like are obviously people-related metrics, whether that's engagement, right, promotion rates, representation, attrition. And at one point, you were both VP of HR and head of diversity.
Correct.
What's your view on those roles being one and the same, separate? How do you think about the structure of
I spent much of my career, I've always been in HR because my diversity roles have always sat within an HR structure. I can be really candid with everyone and say, for the most part, diversity and HR don't have the most harmonious relationship. And it's not a function of being incompatible as roles. For a long time, the role of the HR professional is to treat everyone equally, treat everyone the same. The role of diversity is to meet people where they are. And that's like the opposite of what you're taught as an HR professional. So reconciling those things, what I can tell you is HR needs to not only understand diversity, they need to learn to be good diversity practitioners. We can't talk to frontline managers and expect them to do this if they don't have HR partners who are going to be great stewards, great partners, great coaches around how to create an inclusive environment where people feel they belong as well. And what does equity really look like? A long time ago, I used to sit in rooms where I would hear people talking about some woman leader who's really great, but we can't offer her this next opportunity because she just had a child. Well, that's called discrimination. And so if you're an HR person who doesn't understand what's wrong with that, or is supporting and endorsing that kind of behavior and thinking, you become part of the problem. You're not part of the solution for how you create a diverse and inclusive environment.
So I was speaking with a chief diversity officer of a fast-growing startup a couple weeks ago, and he was saying that one of the challenges that he's had to face is this dynamic between HR, which is traditionally risk-averse, and diversity, which actually needs to take risk. And he gave a specific example around visually identifying candidates, like white, Black, Latina, which of course is not going to be perfect. And he was saying, but we need something so that we can understand what our pipeline looks like. And HR, if it were up to HR, we wouldn't do any of this. But if I'm going to achieve my objectives of diversifying our funnel and understanding what our conversion rates look like, I need the data. How do you think about the push and pull of risk for HR on the diversity side and the need for risk taking in order to advance and do something that we haven't done before?
So we've got to take intelligent risks. It's not just risk taking. It's what's the purpose of the risk and how does it drive the outcome? I'm very results oriented and I want to know that I am creating something. And most businesses are very data oriented in today's environment. It's almost impossible to successfully operate a business and not have data that provides insights that become actionable. And so diversity is no different. I think the inherent problem with diversity is when people only think of diversity in relation to numbers. Large numbers, small numbers, they all have relevance in their place. It's really easy to jump to a conclusion if the numbers are small. May not be the right conclusion. All it is that the numbers are small. But really critical, and I think this is where sometimes this work of diversity and HR and legal becomes a little stressed and there's tension. We have to create smart data, and that means that we have to have some capacity to collect data. And it also requires that we create an environment where people trust that the data that is being shared is being shared for good. Like, why would I want to disclose my identity if that information is going to be used against me or just not used at all? Like, are you sitting on this data and not doing something that benefits me around it? And we all want to understand how we can benefit from the data that comes. For a people manager, the benefit may be, how do we determine whether you're a great manager or not? Well, we determine how many people, stay and how many people grow. We might even determine that you're pretty great because you're able to compose teams of people who come from different backgrounds and experiences, and they do really well together and they create immense value together, as opposed to, did you hire the team that you last worked with in the last environment you were in, thinking that you just bring that magic with you and replicate it? And sometimes that works, but the real question is, how are you building for the future and not just replicating the past? Teddy, you've probably heard me say same plus same equals the same. So, Einstein said that, you can't create a new outcome with the same mindset that created the existing one. It's very much for me the same thing. If you can't build difference, you can't build a new future. If you're bringing the same past with you, you've actually got to introduce a different set of variables, and that includes different talents to be able to create a new outcome.
All right, we've got 5 minutes left. For everybody who's on the line today, who's a hiring manager, what's one thing that they can be doing today, this afternoon, tomorrow, to start to advance, building a more diverse pipeline, being more inclusive in their approach to hiring? Like, what's one tactical thing that we can be doing tomorrow?
So begin with yourself. I want you to think about your own network. Safe way of saying this is, think about the people if you're married, think about the people you invited to your wedding. If you're not married and never thought to get married, think about the people you'd invite to your wedding. That's your network. They're the people you share big things with, little things with. They're the people you went to school with, members of your family, work with. What do they have in common and what's different about them? And how do they differ from you? And if what you begin to find is that 9 out of 10 of the people in that list of 10 or 20 people you've put together are a lot like you, it may look like, you're 40 something and you're married and they're 40 something and they're married. Or if you're a woman and with an MBA and they're all women with MBAs, we do a lot of pattern repetition. Think about what you can do to disrupt the pattern and differentiate your network. How will you introduce a new way of operating, a new way of seeing things? I'm a social network analyst by training, Teddy, and one of the things I've seen in people is that sometimes our networks are either too stale, meaning the people you trust are people you've trusted for, more than 3 years, or our networks are very new. If you look at the people you're including in your network, you've known them for less than a year. How is your network a portfolio that's comprised of old and new and experiences like yours and experiences dissimilar and backgrounds like yours and backgrounds different from?
Follow on that. We operate now in like post-COVID world. A lot of people are working from their attics, from their bedrooms.
Yeah.
How do you think about very tactically delivering on or acting on that imperative for diversifying?
Yeah. Jump onto a Clubhouse if you're already able to get access and listen to conversations you haven't listened to. There's this like amazing tool called LinkedIn where you have an opportunity to connect with people.
That was a layup. Sorry, that was just like too easy.
It's like one of my, I use it all the time. I used it all the time before I came to LinkedIn. I was found on LinkedIn, but literally what I've literally come to recognize is that differentiating network is a question of wanting to. There are very few obstacles to it. Whether you're an introvert or an extrovert is like entirely irrelevant. You can do it in the quiet comfort of your home with one person at a time. I advise people to invest in the rule of 24. How will you use 24 hours in your year? Whether it's 2 hours every month, whether it's, 4 hours a quarter, or whether it's, 3 days in the year, to truly just invest in relationships that are either unformed or unknown to you, to get to know different people with different backgrounds and different ways of operating. It could be over coffee. It could be virtually on Zoom with your coffee. It could be someone you met at a conference, or it could be someone you recruited and it didn't go well. But how are you nurturing relationships? And if you take those 24 hours in the year and choose to invest them in 24 people that year or just in 4 people that year, how are you ensuring that you're building new relationships and then investing and cultivating those relationships over time?
I will add one more thing, which is ask for help. Like I've asked for you, right? To say, hey, you are connected to a different network than me. This is the kind of person I'm looking to meet. This is the kind of thing that we're looking to hire. Can you help?
Absolutely.
It's been super, super valuable.
Well, it's the ultimate proof of leadership. Leaders do nothing alone. This is the one thing I learned, and I'm thankful for it. If you're doing it by yourself, you're probably going to struggle and you may not do it that well. Ask for help, find someone you can trust. And if you don't know someone already, if you read an article and you see someone's doing that, reach out to them. People genuinely want to help each other. I think more often than not, they will find a way to help each other. And if the first person you reach out to isn't available, go on to the next person. When you're working on the talent side of business, this is always sales. We're trying to sell and create a new outcome.
Rosanna, thank you so much for the hour. Super productive, really, really fun. There were maybe 5 or 6 questions that were really good that I didn't get to. I'm going to send them to you via email and you can answer them. You can send them back to folks. I'll send them to recording, but thank you, Rosanna. I really appreciate the time.
Teddy, always a pleasure to see you. It's great to be a part of this with you, and wishing everyone a lot of success here. We've got a big game to play, and each and every one of us can make a difference.
That's the debrief. Thanks, Rosanna.
Ciao.
See y'all.